President Trump continues to face outrage over his response to last weekend's deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where racism and anti-Semitism were on clear display in scenes like this one, when torch-bearing protesters marched on the University of Virginia campus Friday night, chanting "blood and soil," a phrase drawn from Nazi ideology. At Saturday's Unite the Right rally, neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan members also displayed swastikas on flags and banners as they protested the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Members of the local synagogue, Congregation Beth Israel, said that ahead of the protest, while they were praying, men dressed in fatigues and carrying semi-automatic rifles stood across the street from the synagogue, prompting people to leave the service from the back of the building in groups as a safety precaution. Later in the afternoon, Heather Heyer was killed on Saturday when a 20-year-old Nazi sympathizer named James Alex Fields plowed his car into a crowd of anti-fascist demonstrators. In another incident, white supremacists beat 20-year-old African-American protester DeAndre Harris. Following the protest Monday, the New England Holocaust Memorial was vandalized in Boston, Massachusetts, by a teenager who threw a rock through a glass panel etched with numbers symbolizing the numbers tattooed on the arms of Jews and other imprisoned in Nazi Germany's concentration camps. The attack marked the second time this summer that Boston's Holocaust Memorial has been vandalized. It took until Tuesday for President Trump to place blame on white supremacists for the deadly violence in Charlottesville. During a news conference at Trump Tower, he attacked the counter-protesters, repeating his earlier claim that both sides were to blame for the violence. He seemed to ridicule the national movement to remove Confederate monuments, saying the protesters would next want to tear down statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Trump also defended some of the white nationalist protesters who descended on Charlottesville.
I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. Those people were also there because they wanted to protest the taking down of a statue, Robert E. Lee.
On Thursday, President Trump took to Twitter to further complain that it's, quote, sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. The beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced, he tweeted. Leaders of 4 congressional caucuses are now demanding the White House fire senior aide Sebastian Gorka, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller over their white supremacist views. In a letter to President Trump, the Congressional Asian Pacific American, Hispanic, Progressive, and Black caucuses wrote, quote, "We're deeply concerned their continued influence on U.S. policy emboldens and tacitly approves the ideological extremism that leads white supremacists to spread violence and hatred." Now the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect is calling on Twitter to suspend President Trump's personal account after branding him an accomplice to domestic terrorism. For more, we're joined by the group's executive director, Steve Goldstein, executive director of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect. Welcome to Democracy Now! Explain what you're calling for.
Amy, Twitter has a choice here. It can stand with the love that Heather Heyer's life stood for, or it can stand for the hatred that Donald Trump stands for. There are no two sides. Where is Twitter going to stand? Twitter is under no obligation as a private company to carry Donald Trump's hatred. So President Trump has 2 accounts. He has his POTUS account, and for the sake of free speech and getting his hate on record for future generations to look at it and to say never again, listen, for those reasons, keep his presidential account. But he has a personal account, Real Donald Trump, that amplifies his hate. Twitter doesn't have to double down on hate. Twitter has a choice. Get rid of the Real Donald Trump hatred account. Not much better than the POTUS account. At least get rid of one.
Are you concerned about issues of free speech here?
Well, again, he has his POTUS account. Free speech doesn't mean that you have to give hate twice the megaphone when he already has 1 megaphone. That seems to us a Solomonic solution.
Talk about his response. On Monday, teleprompter news, he makes a teleprompter statement, some called it a hostage video, where he condemned and named the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis. This directly contradicting what he had said 2 days before when he said that all sides were responsible for the violence, and then the next day, on Tuesday, reverting back to what he said on Saturday, and particularly focusing on the fact that the white supremacists had a permit for their protest, unlike the counter-protesters.
Well, Amy, I was horrified on Monday by the coverage of the mainstream media that applauded the president for his hostage news conference, in which he read a teleprompter with all the energy of a power outage in New York City. He didn't look like he meant every word, any word. He looked like there was a figurative gun to his head. He didn't want to be there. And when I read the media reports, they said, aha, the president finally came out. You've got to be kidding. The president said nothing after Charlottesville. Finally, he was forced to. Have we so normalized hate that that Monday press conference that was scripted should get applause?
Not even a press conference, a
And
statement.
not even a press conference. But what kind of world has America landed in? Where is our morality that we are settling for the crumbs of a fake condemnation? Now,
well, we learned it was fake on Tuesday.
And we learned it was fake on Tuesday. Here's the thing. It's time not to limit ourselves to saying that President Trump commits acts of racism, sexism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-LGBT. The president is a racist, the president is Islamophobic, and the president is anti-Semitic. Call it out for what it is, because if you don't, you're normalizing the underlying conditions. Now, why would I say that? We've seen again and again a pattern. How many times do we have to see that if a president quacks like a racist duck, walks like a racist duck, and does everything in his power to be a racist duck, he is a racist duck?
What does this have to do with Anne Frank? You're executive director of the Anne Frank Center.
So let me say this. There are those not in your audience who would say, Stephen, aren't you coming on a little too strong for the Anne Frank Center? No. Anne Frank did not just write her diary as her own personal experience, which she included. She also wrote it as one of social justice's greatest exhortations. She wrote that we have to act to prevent never again. So, Amy, never again is supposed to be an early warning system. If we don't shout this danger from the rooftops, when will we? When history has taken its worst stages of progression, that's when we're going to shout it from the rooftops? Please.
Meanwhile, leaders, let me turn to leaders of 4 congressional caucuses demanding the White House fire senior aides Sebastian Gorka, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller over their white supremacist views. In a letter to President Trump, the Congressional Asia-Pacific American, Hispanic, Progressive, and Black caucuses wrote, "We are deeply concerned their continued influence on U.S. policy emboldens and tacitly approves the ideological extremism that leads white supremacists to spread violence and hatred." Talk about who Sebastian Gorka is today, and also the calls, the expose by the Jewish Forward about his ties to far-right Nazi groups in Hungary.
Well, Sebastian Gorka has links to a Hungarian neo-Nazi organization called the Vitenzi Rend. His father was a member, so the Daily Forward reported, and Sebastian Gorka actually wears his father's neo-Nazi sympathetic Vitenzi Rend medal. Sebastian Gorka has worn it on many occasions in their photos. Sebastian Gorka says wearing this neo-Nazi medal is merely a tribute to his late father. I'm sorry, didn't Dad have a favorite tie? Really? I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't particularly wear my father's neo-Nazi medals.
And Steve Bannon.
Okay, Steve Bannon is beneath contempt. Here's the politics we have in the White House. President Trump is clearly afraid to fire Steve Bannon because President Trump probably wonders what hell Steve Bannon will cause out there. Steve Bannon's destroying the country. He's got to go.
Let me play what President Trump had to say about him, insisting that Steve Bannon is not a racist.
I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that, and I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon, but he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
Donald Trump talking about Steve Bannon.
Well, Donald Trump really is the expert on seeing whether somebody is racist. Give me a break. Come on. But, you know, I'm intrigued by that clip. We had Heather Heyer die on Saturday, and President Trump is talking about his alleged victory for president. How narcissistic can you get? What President Trump should have done in Trump Tower is be a leader, commune with our grief. And Amy, this isn't partisan, because we had every president of the last few generations knew how to commune with grief, not this president.
On Wednesday, neo-Nazi leader Richard Spencer spoke with Israeli media and compared his views to those held by Zionists. This is Spencer speaking to Channel 2 News, Israel.
As an Israeli citizen, someone who understands your identity, who has a sense of nationhood and peoplehood and the history and of an experience of the Jewish people, you should respect someone like me who has analogous feelings about whites. I mean, you could say that I am a white Zionist in the sense that I care about my people. I want us to have a secure homeland that's for us and ourselves, just like you want a secure homeland in Israel.
That is white supremacist Richard Spencer.
Well, I'm a proud Jew. I'm a proud supporter of Israel. I'm a proud supporter of a two-state solution for Israel living side by side with an independent Palestinian state together in love and cooperation. That is repulsive. Wherever you stand on the Middle East, I don't care if you're left, right, or center, what we just heard is repulsive. And President Trump is bad for the Israelis. He's bad for the Palestinians. Talk about an opportunity to unify us. That was exploitation. I want to throw up.
I want to end with David Duke speaking in Charlottesville, Virginia this weekend. The KKK leader said white nationalists are going to, quote, fulfill the promises of Donald Trump's presidency.
This represents a turning point for the people of this country. We are determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back, and that's what we got to do.
Well, during the presidential campaign last year, then candidate Donald Trump came under fire for inciting his supporters to violence. Here's one example.
If you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously. Okay? Just knock the hell. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees. I promise. I promise.
So that was President Trump then, and of course we see what he's saying today. Final comments, Richard Goldstein of the Anne Frank Center.
Stephen Goldstein. But I have a brother, Richard. I don't mind. But listen, how is Melania's cyberbullying campaign going? We see in that clip that there is almost no space, in fact none, between Donald Trump's rhetoric and David Duke's rhetoric. We have a rhetorical convergence between the hate speech of the President of the United States and, as we saw in that clip, David Duke. That's what America has become, and we can all weep.
Stephen Goldstein will leave it there, Executive Director of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect. When we come back, part 2 of our conversation with a former white supremacist, as well as a nephew of a white supremacist who marched this weekend in Charlottesville. Stay with us.